Sitting on, watching the time, listen, sitting here resting.
Some voices don't just entertain you, they find you. They reach past everything you've built around yourself and touch something you forgot was there. That's what R&B and soul music has always done. And the 12 artists in this countdown did it better than almost anyone who ever stood in front of a microphone.
Let me tell you about a place.
But here's what most people never knew. Behind those voices, behind those records that made you feel understood, that played at your wedding, that helped you survive your worst nights, were lives carrying weight that would have broken most of us long before the first note was ever recorded. We're talking about genius stolen from, brilliance exploited, greatness that fought systems designed to take everything and leave nothing, and in some cases, lives that ended in ways so devastating, so painfully unfair, that knowing the full story changes how you hear the music forever. This countdown moves through 12 of the most remarkable, most heartbreaking, and most important lives in the history of American music. Every entry goes deeper than the greatest hits. Every chapter reveals something the headlines missed. If you're someone who believes these stories deserve to be told completely and told right, subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling us which artist's story has stayed with you the longest. And stay with us until the very end, because the story we've saved for number 1 contains details that will stop you cold. The countdown starts now. Entry number 12, Ruth Brown. Before we name number 12, consider this. There was a record label in the early 1950s that became one of the most powerful in the music business. Producers respected it. Artists wanted to be signed to it. And it got there almost entirely on the strength of one woman's voice. They called it the house that Ruth built. Ruth Brown was born in Portsmouth, Virginia in 1928, the daughter of a choir director. She grew up inside the church, not just attending it, but shaped by it. Gospel gave her the technical foundation that most trained singers spend years trying to develop. It gave her breath control, emotional range, and an instinct for phrasing that no classroom could teach. When she crossed over into R&B and signed with Atlantic Records, she brought all of that with her. Between 1949 and 1955, she placed more singles on the R&B charts than virtually any other artist on the label. She was the engine, the commercial foundation that kept Atlantic financially alive during its most critical years. And then the royalties never came. Not a mistake, not an oversight, a pattern. Label accounting structures that were standard practice at the time ensured that the money generated by her recordings flowed upward to executives, to publishers, to the label itself, while Ruth Brown, the woman whose voice had built the entire operation, struggled financially for decades. It took her years of public campaigning, legal pressure, and the support of advocacy organizations before Atlantic finally acknowledged what had happened. The settlement she eventually reached, and the legal precedents her fight helped establish, became a foundation that future artists would stand on when negotiating their own contracts. She won, but she should never have had to fight in the first place. Ruth Brown's story opens this countdown because it names the system every other artist on this list had to navigate. And as we move through these 12 lives, that system will appear again and again, wearing different faces, producing the same results. Entry number 11, The Cost of Crossing Over. Ruth Brown was not alone in what she experienced. She was one voice inside a pattern so consistent, so deliberately constructed, that understanding it changes how you hear the entire history of R&B. When gospel-trained singers made the move into secular music during the 1940s and 1950s, they brought something the industry immediately recognized as commercially valuable. What many of them didn't bring was legal protection. Most signed their first contracts without representation. The language was intentionally complex. Royalty structures were designed to produce the appearance of fairness while systematically redirecting earnings away from performers. And because many of these artists came from communities with limited financial resources and even more limited access to legal counsel, the terms they agreed to in those early years followed them for the rest of their careers. There was another practice that compounded the damage. When an R&B record became commercially successful, it was common for a white artist to record the same song, often with a nearly identical arrangement, and release it to mainstream pop radio. That cover version would frequently outsell the original. The publishing royalties it generated went elsewhere. The original artist received almost nothing from the success their own creativity had made possible. Label audits and court records established these practices with documented specificity. This was not industry gossip. This was the architecture of exploitation, built into the business from the beginning. The artists who crossed over from gospel into R&B paid for that crossing in ways their audiences never saw. And what makes the next entry in this countdown so devastating is that the artist we're about to discuss didn't just face financial exploitation, he faced something far more final, a career frozen in place before it ever had the chance to show the world where it was going. Entry number 10, Otis Redding. There are artists who reach their peak and hold it, and then there are artists who are still climbing when everything stops. Otis Redding was still climbing. He was born in Dawson, Georgia, in 1941, the son of a Baptist minister. His family moved to Macon when he was a child, and it was there, in the churches, at the talent shows, absorbing Little Richard and Sam Cooke from the radio, that he began to understand what his voice could do. It wasn't polished, it wasn't refined in the way the industry preferred. It was raw and direct and completely honest, and that honesty was exactly what made it extraordinary.
Had nothing to live for, son.
He signed with Stax Records and built his reputation through recordings and relentless touring. But the moment that changed everything happened in June 1967 at the Monterey Pop Festival in California. The audience was predominantly young and white, a rock crowd that had never been fully exposed to Southern soul performed at that intensity. Otis Redding walked out and dismantled every boundary in the room. By the time he finished, people were on their feet who hadn't stood up for anyone that weekend. That performance should have been the beginning of his largest chapter. In December 1967, just days before his death, he recorded Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, a song that was quieter and more contemplative than anything he had released before. Producers who were present during those sessions noted that he was deliberately moving his sound in a new direction. He knew something was shifting. On December 10, 1967, the plane carrying Otis Redding and members of his band, the Bar-Kays, crashed into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin. He was 26 years old. The song was released posthumously. It became his only #1 pop hit. He never heard it on the radio. What Otis Redding would have become is one of the most painful unanswered questions in the history of American music, and the next artist on this countdown had answers, but the circumstances surrounding his death left questions that have never been fully resolved.
Change gon' come. I go downtown.
Entry number 9, Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke understood the music industry in a way that most of his peers simply did not, and that understanding made him dangerous to the people profiting from artists who didn't ask questions.
Gon' come.
He was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1931 and raised on the south side of Chicago. Gospel was his first language. By his early 20s, he was the lead voice of the Soul Stirrers, one of the most respected gospel groups in the country.
It's been a long. I was born.
His crossover into pop music in 1957 was controversial within the gospel community. Some felt he had abandoned something sacred. What he had actually done was carry it forward into new territory.
Long. In a little tent.
The records he made between 1957 and 1964 demonstrated a vocal control and emotional intelligence that set him apart from almost everyone working in popular music at the time. But Sam Cooke was building something beyond recordings. He established his own publishing company and his own record label.
Ain't that news, man, telling me that she was on her way.
In an era when black artists routinely signed away their rights and their royalties, Sam Cooke was constructing the infrastructure to own his work. That was not common, that was not welcomed by the industry around him, and it was exactly the kind of power that made his position complicated.
Good news, man, ain't that news, all to herself.
In October 1964, he recorded A Change Is Gonna Come. The song drew directly from his own experience of racial discrimination, including a documented incident where he and his companions were turned away from a whites-only motel in Louisiana.
Found out she don't want nobody else. Ain't that good news?
The recording became one of the most significant songs in American history, a private grief transformed into a public declaration. 2 months later, on December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was dead at 33. The official investigation produced a finding of justifiable homicide.
Ain't that news, man?
The circumstances surrounding that night have been publicly debated for 6 decades. What is not debated is what his death cost, the music, the movement, and the blueprint he was building for artists who came after him. Entry #8, Donny Hathaway. There are recordings in the history of soul music that feel like they came from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. When you hear them, you don't just feel the emotion, you feel the specific weight of a mind that understood music at a level most people never reach. Donny Hathaway was that mind. He was born in Chicago in 1945 and raised largely by his grandmother, a gospel singer who recognized early that her grandson's relationship with music was not typical. He was playing piano by ear as a small child. By the time he enrolled at Howard University on a fine arts scholarship, he was already more musically sophisticated than most of the professional musicians working around him. He arranged, he produced, he played multiple instruments with genuine mastery. And then there was the voice, warm, precise, and capable of communicating a depth of feeling that left producers and collaborators searching for words to describe it. His duet recordings with Roberta Flack produced some of the most emotionally complete music of the 1970s. His solo work demonstrated a harmonic sophistication that musicians still study today. But behind the recordings, Donny Hathaway was fighting something the industry around him had no framework to address. Family members and close collaborators have spoken publicly about his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that went largely untreated during the most commercially active period of his career. Studio pressure was relentless. The expectation to deliver, to perform, to produce, regardless of what was happening internally, never paused. Producer accounts from this era document an industry culture where vulnerability was managed rather than supported, and substances became a common coping mechanism for artists whose mental health needs were being ignored. On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway died after falling from a 15th floor window of a New York hotel. He was 33 years old. The investigation ruled his death a suicide. The recordings he left behind contain no indication of what he was carrying. That is either a testament to his artistry or the most heartbreaking fact about his entire story.
Goes away.
Entry number 7, Bill Withers. Not every artist in this countdown was destroyed by the industry. Some saw clearly enough to walk away before the damage became permanent.
And if she's gone to stay.
Bill Withers was born in 1938 in Slab Fork, West Virginia, a small coal mining community where working-class life was the only life available. He grew up without any formal music training and spent his 20s in the United States Navy.
Ain't no gone.
After his discharge, he worked on aircraft assembly lines in California while teaching himself to write songs in his spare time. He was 32 years old when he released his first album.
Anytime she goes away, goes away.
That late start gave him something most artists who sign at 19 never develop, a clear sense of who he was before the industry ever had a chance to tell him who to be. Lean on Me, Ain't No Sunshine, Lovely Day, Just the Two of Us. These recordings connected with people across every demographic boundary because they were written from lived experience rather than industry formula. Listeners recognized the difference immediately, even if they couldn't name it. But the music business pushed back. Creative disputes with label representatives who wanted more commercially predictable material created friction that wore on him. The pressure to subordinate his instincts to someone else's commercial calculations conflicted directly with the honest, personal approach that had made his work valuable in the first place. By the mid-1980s, Bill Withers made a decision almost no successful artist of his stature has ever made. He stopped. He walked away from the recording industry, declined interviews, and returned to private life. Not because he had failed, because he had decided that his well-being mattered more than his visibility. He died in March 2020. His songs were playing in hospitals around the world at the time, including in the wards treating patients during a global pandemic, because what he recorded was so fundamentally human that it never stopped being needed. The next entry in this countdown involves an artist whose body made that choice for him, not gradually, but in a single devastating moment, on a stage, in front of thousands of people. This story has already revealed moments many people never knew about, and there are still powerful chapters ahead. Subscribe if you appreciate thoughtful documentaries that go beyond the headlines and explore the complete story.
If diseases go together like a road with bumps, then I want to see it.
Entry number 6, Jackie Wilson. There are performers, and then there are forces of nature wearing a performer's face. Jackie Wilson was the second kind. He was born in Detroit in 1934, raised in a neighborhood where survival required toughness and talent in roughly equal measure. As a teenager, he boxed, he ran with street gangs, and he sang with a voice that operated across a range most trained vocalists spend entire careers trying to reach, attached to a physical presence on stage that left audiences unable to look away. James Brown cited him. Michael Jackson studied him. Elvis Presley acknowledged his influence openly. When Jackie Wilson performed, he moved like gravity had different rules for him, and he sang like the emotion was coming directly through his body, rather than through any learned technique.
Listen to me, see, but come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, baby.
His commercial success through the late 1950s and 1960s was substantial, but the financial architecture surrounding that success followed the same pattern this countdown has traced from the beginning. Managerial arrangements documented in subsequent legal proceedings ensured that the wealth generated by his recordings and performances moved away from him rather than toward him. He generated millions. He held very little of it. On September 29, 1975, Jackie Wilson was performing at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was on stage singing Reet Petite when he suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed. He struck his head on the stage when he fell. The brain damage he sustained was severe and permanent.
I want the world to know now it's that is why.
He never performed again. He never fully regained consciousness. For the next 9 years, Jackie Wilson lived in a care facility. The music industry that had profited enormously from his talent provided minimal financial support during that period. He died on January 21, 1984. He was one of the most gifted performers the 20th century produced. He spent the last 9 years of his life in a condition that prevented him from hearing a single note of his own music. Entry number 5, Solomon Burke. If Jackie Wilson's story is about what can be taken in a single moment, Solomon Burke's story is about what cannot be taken at all, no matter how long the industry tries. He was born in Philadelphia in 1940, into a family so deeply embedded in church life that he was preaching as a child minister before most children his age had memorized their multiplication tables. His gospel foundation was not simply musical, it was his entire identity, his moral framework, and the source of a vocal authority that would define his sound for the next 6 decades. When he moved into soul music through Atlantic Records in the early 1960s, he brought that authority with him. Recordings like Cry to Me, Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, and Got to Get You Off My Mind established him as a foundational figure of the genre, an artist whose influence on Mick Jagger, Van Morrison, and dozens of other performers has been publicly and repeatedly acknowledged.
Ladies and gentlemen,
But commercial trends shifted. The industry moved toward sounds that didn't center voices like his, and Solomon Burke entered a long middle period, not a collapse, but a gradual reduction in mainstream visibility that frustrated an artist of his stature and contradicted everything his talent deserved. He kept performing. He kept recording. He carried his catalog across decades with a consistency that spoke to genuine artistic conviction rather than commercial calculation. Then in 2002, producer Joe Henry brought together a collection of prominent musicians and admirers to record an album with Burke titled Don't Give Up on Me. The critical response was immediate and overwhelming. New audiences encountered a voice they had never heard before. Longtime listeners were reminded of what they had always known. Solomon Burke died in 2010 at the age of 70. He had recorded well into his final years. His story belongs in this countdown, not as tragedy, but as evidence. Evidence that real talent, properly rooted, outlasts everything the industry throws at it. What comes next is harder. The next chapter combines financial ruin with personal loss in ways that reveal how completely the forces in this countdown could converge on a single life. Entry number 4. The pattern that built poverty from success. By the time we reach entry number 4, a pattern has appeared so consistently across this countdown that it demands to be named directly. Chart success and financial security were not the same thing. For black R&B artists operating in the mid-20th century, they were frequently opposites. The mechanisms were specific and documented. Standard contracts of the era included royalty structures that appeared reasonable on the surface while containing accounting provisions that made meaningful payment nearly impossible to collect. Publishing rights, the portion of songwriting income that generates revenue every time a song is played, covered, or licensed, were routinely signed away in early deals by artists who had no legal representation and no framework for understanding what they were surrendering. When a song became a hit, the money it generated traveled upward through a chain of publishers, managers, and label executives before it ever approached the performer. Entry number 3, Marvin Gaye. There are artists who make music about their lives, and then there are artists whose lives and music become so completely intertwined that separating one from the other becomes impossible. Marvin Gaye was the second kind. He was born in Washington, D.C. In 1939, the son of a minister whose household was, by multiple documented accounts, defined by strict religious discipline and a difficult emotional environment. The relationship between Marvin Gaye and his father was complex in ways that would surface repeatedly throughout his life, both privately and in the music he eventually made about family, tenderness, and pain. He arrived at Motown Records in the early 1960s as a session drummer before his vocal talent became impossible to ignore. His commercial success through that decade was consistent and substantial, but Marvin Gaye was not content to produce what the label's commercial machinery expected from him. In 1971, he delivered What's Going On, an album Motown initially refused to release because it was political, personal, and musically ambitious in ways that challenged every formula the label had built its business on. He insisted. The album was released. It sold enormously, received critical praise that has never diminished, and is now recognized as one of the most significant American recordings of the 20th century. That victory cost him something. The friction it created with the label, combined with a series of personal losses, a failed marriage, financial pressures including substantial tax debt, and the death of his close collaborator and friend Tammy Terrell, contributed to a period of withdrawal and instability that followed him through the 1970s. He recorded abroad. He sought stability outside the American industry's reach. He made music that continued to reveal the interior of a life under enormous pressure. On April 1, 1984, the day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed at his parents' home in Los Angeles. His father was charged with first-degree murder. A subsequent medical examination revealed a brain tumor that his attorneys argued had affected the elder Gaye's behavior. The charge was reduced. He received a suspended sentence. Marvin Gaye's death forced a public conversation about domestic violence within households the world had idealized. It was painful and necessary and long overdue. What he left behind, the recordings, the innovations, the insistence on honesty over formula, has never stopped generating conversation, influence, and grief. If you've been enjoying this documentary so far, consider subscribing. It helps us continue producing carefully researched documentaries that celebrate remarkable lives while uncovering the stories many people have never heard. Entry #2, the fight that changed the rules. There is a version of this countdown that ends with loss, with exploitation, with brilliant lives consumed by systems that were never designed to protect them. But that is not the complete story, because some of the artists in this countdown fought back. And when they won for everyone who came after them. Ruth Brown opened this documentary at number 12. We return to her now, not to repeat her story, but to complete it. Because what she did after she discovered the full extent of what had been taken from her deserves its own chapter in the history of the music industry. By the 1980s, Ruth Brown had spent decades largely outside the commercial spotlight. The royalties from the recordings that had built Atlantic Records had never arrived. She was working as a cleaning woman and a bus driver to support herself, a woman whose voice had funded a label empire, driving a bus because that empire had kept its accounting arrangements deliberately out of her reach. She could have accepted it. Many artists of her generation did, because the legal and financial cost of fighting a major label felt impossible to absorb on top of everything else. Ruth Brown chose differently. Her campaign drew attention to royalty accounting practices that had been standard industry procedure for decades, practices that, once examined openly, were difficult to defend. Atlantic eventually reached a settlement with Brown and other affected artists. Beyond the financial recovery, her fight contributed directly to the establishment of the Rhythm and Blues Foundation, an organization created specifically to provide financial assistance and advocacy to pioneering R&B artists who had been economically exploited during the formative years of the genre. The legal and public precedents her campaign helped establish gave subsequent generations of artists a documented history of exploitation to reference in their own contract negotiations. The royalty protections that many contemporary artists now take for granted exist, in part because Ruth Brown refused to be quiet. She received a Tony Award in 1989 for her performance in the Broadway musical Black and Blue. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted her in 1993. She had spent decades being ignored by the industry she helped build. Then she made the industry answer for it. Her story transitions us toward the artist who understood all of this, the exploitation, the legal vulnerability, the commercial machinery, before it could happen to him. And then built something designed to stop it. That artist is number one. Entry #1, Ray Charles. Before we begin, understand this. The artist at number 1 in this countdown is not here simply because his story is the most tragic. He is here because his single life contains every thread this documentary has followed: poverty, exploitation, addiction, recovery, civil rights, creative brilliance, business acumen, and a legacy so permanent that the world is still living inside it. Ray Charles Robinson was born in Albany, Georgia, on September 23, 1930. His family moved to Greenville, Florida, when he was still an infant. They were poor in the specific way that rural black families in the Jim Crow South were poor, not a lack of ambition, but a systematic absence of economic access that had been maintained deliberately for generations. When Ray was 4 years old, he watched his younger brother George drown in a washtub. He was present. He could not prevent it. That moment stayed with him for the rest of his life, surfacing in interviews and accounts with a grief that decades could not fully dissolve. Shortly afterward, he began losing his sight. Glaucoma, progressing without access to adequate medical treatment, took his vision entirely by the time he was 7 years old. His mother, Aretha, a woman of extraordinary practical determination, made a decision that shaped everything that followed. She refused to treat her son as someone defined by his blindness. She insisted he learn to manage. She sent him to the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in St. Augustine, where he received formal musical training in classical piano, composition, and theory. Then, when Ray was 15, his mother died. He was alone, completely, a blind 15-year-old black boy in the Jim Crow South with no family support and no financial resources. What he had was music, and a clarity about what he needed to do with it that most people twice his age never develop. He moved to Jacksonville, then Orlando, then Seattle, as far from everything familiar as geography allowed. He taught himself to arrange and began working professionally in the Pacific Northwest, absorbing jazz, blues, gospel, and country simultaneously, not as separate genres to be kept in separate rooms, but as a single vocabulary he was assembling for his own use. What he built from that vocabulary would change American music permanently. Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004, in Beverly Hills, California. He was 73 years old. The cause was acute liver failure. He had recorded his final album, Genius Loves Company, a collection of duets with artists including Norah Jones, B.B. King, and Elton John, just weeks before his death. It was released posthumously. It won 8 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. Even at the end, he was producing work that the industry recognized as essential. But the full weight of Ray Charles's legacy cannot be measured in Grammy Awards or chart positions or even in the master recordings he was wise enough to own. It has to be measured in what his life, taken completely and honestly, reveals about the relationship between extraordinary human beings and the systems they are forced to navigate. He was blind before he was 7. He was an orphan before he was 16. He carried an addiction through the years when his talent was producing its most celebrated work. He was banned by a state whose identity he helped define. And through all of it, every institutional barrier, every personal loss, every system designed to extract his value while limiting his power, he kept making decisions that protected his dignity and his work. That is not a story about genius overcoming adversity. That framing is too simple and too comfortable. This is a story about a human being who paid close attention, made deliberate choices, and refused, consistently and at real cost, to be owned by the people profiting from his talent. Every artist in this countdown deserved that chance. Not all of them got it, and the distance between what Ray Charles was able to build and what artists like Jackie Wilson, Donny Hathaway, and Ruth Brown were denied is not a measure of individual difference. It is a measure of what the system allowed and what it prevented, and for whom. The music these 12 artists left behind remains present everywhere. It scores films, anchors political moments, plays in hospitals, and surfaces in the work of every generation of performers that has followed. It endures because it was made honestly, with everything these artists had, under circumstances that demanded everything they could give. When you hear these recordings now, you are hearing the complete account, the joy and the exploitation, the brilliance and the cost. The triumph and the grief that lived inside the same voice, sometimes inside the same note. That is what soul music has always carried, and that is why it never stops reaching people. These 12 artists gave us that, all of it. And the least we can do, the very least, is know their stories completely. If you stayed until the end, thank you for spending time learning these remarkable stories. Subscribe for more carefully researched Black celebrity documentaries that preserve important legacies, celebrate remarkable lives, and uncover the stories history should never forget. And if one of these 12 artists has stayed with you, if one of these stories changed how you hear the music, tell us in the comments. These conversations matter, and there are more stories coming that deserve exactly the same attention. The next documentary countdown on this channel goes deeper into territory that most platforms never touch, the hidden chapters, the forgotten names, and the lives behind the music that the industry never properly acknowledged. If this documentary gave you something, a name you'll research, a record you'll hear differently, a story you'll carry forward, then it did exactly what it was built to do. The music is still playing, the stories are still unfinished, and we will be back.